Yeah, well, now that a lot of the partying is done in South Florida, although it's not completely done, those guys I think are going to party all summer, the Stanley Cup champions. But certainly a very important 7 days now for Panthers GM Bill Zito in trying to re-sign some of his core pending UFAs. Number one in that list in terms of priorities, I believe, is Sam Bennett, the Conn Smythe Trophy winner. And it's one thing for Bennett to have announced to everyone during these celebrations that he's not going anywhere, but the reality is there still had to be a negotiation here, and that's what's going to happen. Bill Zito wants to keep him, Bennett wants to stay, but what is that number? And Bennett has an agent in Darren Ferris, who's also Mitch Marner's agent, that likes to bring his clients to July 1st if their clients are comfortable with that to maximize their leverage. So no question in my mind, Bennett can make $10 million a year over 7 years on the open market. He's not getting $10 million a year in South Florida. So what's the number that makes sense for Bennett? Is it $8 million, a bit less than $8 million? We know that Sam Reinhart signed for 8 times 8 a year ago at this time of year. And then I think second on that list, I think it's Brad Marchand ahead of Aaron Ekblad if I were going to predict the odds of who stays. And this is interesting because I think a couple of weeks ago, the sense was Brad Marchand seemed like more of a rental, but boy, he had such a great Stanley Cup final, become such a good fit there. I think the Panthers will, as Bill Zito has said publicly, try and re-sign Brad Marchand as well. But what number makes sense there? I think you can go actually add a lot of years to that deal with Marchand, bring down the AAV, and sign one of those deals where it's like wink, wink. Maybe he doesn't play all those years at the age of 37, but it's a way to bring down the cap hit. So we'll see if the total dollars can fit for Brad Marchand. And I think that probably leaves out Aaron Ekblad. I'm not going to say there's no chance he re-signs, but the reality is that I don't think there's been a lot of negotiation throughout the year since last summer on Aaron Ekblad. I think term was an issue the last time both sides, talked about a potential extension. There's some hard miles around Ekblad, although he's a very important player on that team. So it just feels like when you look at 3 key pending UFAs that someone gets squeezed out. And listen, I could be wrong, but right now I feel like that's probably Aaron Ekblad, who I think is headed in all likelihood to market. Moving on to Toronto, and speaking of pending UFAs, John Tavares still has not been signed, and that might surprise some people that at the end of the year, it was pretty obvious from Tavares' comments that all he had in mind is staying in Toronto, his home, and wanted to sign an extension. And that remains true. But what is the sweet spot here between Brad Treliving, the Leafs GM, and Pat Brisson, the agent for John Tavares? I checked in on this file again on this day here on Tuesday, and they remain apart. But the good thing is the dialogue continues. They've been talking almost every single day here, and they're grinding away, trying to find a way to get John Tavares signed and extended in Toronto. But, it's not easy. When you look at some of the recent comparables, there are 2 different stories being told. On the one hand, if you're Brad Treliving, you look at Matt Duchene signing for $4.5 million a year times 4, and you say, there's a bargain. Why can't we get that? On the other hand, if you're Pat Brisson, you can look at Brock Nelson signing for $7.5 million times 3 years, and you say, hey, Brock Nelson had fewer points than John Tavares this past season. So it's finding that sweet spot and the term that has proven difficult so far on Tavares, and it's not a guarantee that they figure it out. So Tavares has to be ready to head to market next week if they don't reach a deal. And finally, let's touch on the Montreal Canadiens, who haven't had a big splash yet, but not from a lack of effort. My understanding from talking to other teams around the league is that Habs GM Kent Hughes has been quite energetic in trying to investigate the trade market and understand what's out there in terms of a top 6 upgrade. And I think it's important to point out here that, yes, in a perfect world, it's a number 2 center that the Habs go out and find, but those guys are so hard to find, as other teams are finding out as well, that I think the Habs would be fine with a top 6 winger as well if that's something that's more reasonable, that makes more sense. The bottom line is they want to upgrade their top 6. But I will also note this on Montreal, that this isn't about just making sure they stay in the playoffs, and it's not just about next year. That internally, part of the discussion with Montreal is that let's not lose our view to what this is about. The Habs want to build a contender that takes multiple cracks at it over the next decade. So it's not about next year. of course they want to stay a playoff team, but they're not going to do something stupid and overpay for a short-term hit here just so that they can stay in the playoff picture. And I think that's important to remember, because I guess what I take from that is that if the fit is not there here over the coming weeks and the Canadiens don't find that top 6 upgrade, then that's life. They'll be patient and try to do it in season or maybe even next summer. But again, they're trying to get that done here over the coming weeks.